Hello guys and welcome back to a new episode of Italian Politician of the Week. I am Ipernik, the great is silent, and today we're talking about Giovanni Giolitti, 5 times Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Italy between 1892 and 1921 and one of the most important people in Italian history. Some of you might remember me saying this in Orlando's episode last season. I'm not going to cover people that stopped being relevant before 1939. Initially I wanted to make the limit at 1946, but then I thought how some fascist personalities are also so overlooked, like Balbo, and so I decided to be more tolerant to the ones who were on the wrong side of history. What brought me to go back on my promise was the overwhelming demand by my friends and subscribers who wrote to me on Discord to redo my series on post-unification Italy. I will leave the links to these old videos in the description, although the quality is not the best, so be advised. Before talking about Giolitti's impact on Italian history, I think it's necessary for me to contextualize in order to give you an idea of how Italy was at the beginning of the 20th century. If you have watched my channel for a while, you will know that I mostly cover the years after the Second World War, where Italy was growing into a very developed nation. But Italy during the Giolitti era, despite the promising signs and the potential, was nothing like its future self. Without further ado, let's roll the intro. Since there is little to no footage of this time period, I will be using some gameplay to fill the dead zones. So let's begin with 1870. After multiple conflicts which saw General Giuseppe Garibaldi, King Victor Emmanuel II and Prime Minister Camillo Benso Cavour as their protagonists, Italy was reunited under the Crown of Savoy in the Kingdom of Piedmont. Since 1848, Piedmont had become a constitutional monarchy where a legislative assembly was elected by the property owners of the nation, which is like 5% of the population. This rule was kept and applied to the new territories, but when they conquered the Papal State, Pope Pius IX straight up refused to recognize the new nation and called for the non-expedit, which essentially forced the Catholics to not vote at the elections. This petty measure lowered the electoral base even more, now being like 2% of the population. For around 30 years, the parliament was then elected by the secular, educated upper classes. There were no parties back then, but most, if not all, the parliamentarians were wealthy classical liberals. Back then, being a politician, despite being a position of power, didn't really grant a salary, so the only people who could afford to be elected were very few, further cementing the class divide and also encouraging corruption. The first 10 years of the kingdom were characterized by the years of the historical right, where right-leaning liberals pressed for the Piedmontization of the country, taking down uprisings and forcing Savoy rule on the population. After the 1870s, the first few left-wing ideas started to become popular even among the wealthy, and this allowed the left-wing liberals to take over, and they introduced welfare, public education, old-age pensions, and began colonization of the African continent. The two men responsible for Italy's earliest developments and internationalization are Agostino de Pretis and Francesco Crispi. The former introduced public schooling as well as tariffs, which helped develop the Italian industrial sector and removed the ground tax. Crispi, on the other hand, passed many civil reforms such as the abolishment of the death penalty and the introduction of the right to strike. He is also credited for the creation of the Triple Alliance of 1882 between Germany and Austria and began Italian colonization throughout the Horn of Africa, with mixed results. Crispi eventually fell out of favor in 1891 after the parliament refused to approve his tax increases in order to finance his colonial campaigns and the welfare. He will be substituted by Antonio Starabba Rudini, a member of the historical right, who, unlike his predecessor, tried to reverse his social policies and rebalance the state balance, something that could be done either by increasing taxes or cutting on the military. The first option was already a no-go, since since it was what made Crispi resign in the first place. And the second one was also impossible, since the king, now Umberto I, didn't want to sacrifice a portion of the army for the sake of Italy's economy. Rudini then resigned, not being able to do shit, and a certain Giovanni Giolitti took over in 1892. Giolitti, our protagonist, was a member of the historical left, but throughout his political career, he earned the reputation for being somebody who was excellent at hearing everyone's side of the story and later finding a compromise which helped him the most. Since the times of the Pretice, Italian leaders had been playing the principle of trasformism, a political strategy which consisted in the isolation of the political extremes and to concentrate all the power and effort in the center. It is thanks to this strategy that the left-wing liberals were able to maintain power throughout most of the timeline so far, but Giolitti was different. Realizing the sticky situation he was in, instead of debating with the parliament over the tax increase, he started to develop a new tax plan which would base the level of revenue on the individual income of the person. This could have worked if given enough time, but the people were getting restless over the economic crisis and the rise of prices, not to mention the Roman bank scandal of 1893, where a particular bank was accused of printing illegal banknotes in order to cover fiscal gaps in their budget. Giolitti was somehow bound to this mess and was forced to resign that same year. 1893 was a year characterized by a lot of political unrest and economic instability. Crispi will take the lead again after Giolitti's resignation and put a certain Sidney Sonnino at the Ministry of Finance. Sonnino is a member of the historical right, the same people who wanted the taxes to remain the same, so he completely scratched the idea of the finance reform brought by the left. However, despite this alignment, the fucker increased the taxes anyway, making everyone angry for no reason. Historians see this choice as brave because he filled the deficit by doing so, but the guy was still forced to resign afterwards, and he could have done the reform and made at least one side happy. I can't tell you why he did what he did, but despite the awkward outcome, Italy was still able to take advantage of its newfound economic stability by being able to deal with the rebellion in Sicily. Between 1889 and 1894, an anarcho-socialist group called the Sicilian fascists had been gaining power on the island and organized uprisings. Be careful though, do not mix fascists with fascists. Well, I mean, calling them fascists is not wrong given the context, but back then, being fascist meant being a radical socialist. Only after Mussolini left the Socialist Party, the term became right-wing, but I will elaborate on that another time. In early 1894, Crispi declared the island to be at a state of siege against the rebels, and he mobilized 40,000 troops to suppress the rebellion. In June of that year, an anarchist called Paolo Lega attempted to kill the prime minister but failed, making Crispi more popular in the eyes of the parliament and the Italians overall, hence allowing him to adopt even more authoritarian means in governance and in the dealing of the rebellion. During this time, Francesco Crispi, who was a renowned secular politician, began building friendly relations with the Catholic Church, angering the historical left. Giolitti, alongside the leader of the Radical Party at the time, Felice Cavallotti, began to oppose him openly in the hopes of reducing his popularity. Among the many attempts of discrediting him, Giolitti released a bunch of documents which proved Crispi's involvement in the bank scandal of 2 years before, but Crispi was so popular that the justice system didn't bat an eye. Despite their best effort, Crispi and its new right-wing allies won overwhelmingly at the 1895 elections, putting the left in a much weaker spot. Crispi seemed invulnerable, so much that he decided to lead another expedition of conquest in Ethiopia, hence starting the First Italo-Ethiopian War. You all know how it went. The Ethiopian army under Menelik II, with the help of Russian armaments, kicked Crispi's ass at the Battle of Adwa of 1896, reducing his popularity into atoms. Crispi will resign shortly after, and Rudini will come back to take his place. Between 1896 and 1898, he gave out some lands to the English in the Horn of Africa and tried to suppress Crispi's radical faction. This, however led to many uprisings in the north by other socialists and anarchists, which forced Rudini to resign, and General Luigi Pelot was made prime minister by the king. This government, which ran until 1900, was basically martial law in all but name, and Giolitti and another moderate called Giuseppe Zanardelli strongly opposed it politically. Many restrictions on free speech and personal freedoms were introduced in the name of counter-terrorism. However, this measure proved ineffective and pointless. The general will remain president until the 1900 election, where the left came out victorious and elected a certain Giuseppe Saracco in order to reinstate the liberal rule of law. Considering that during his term the king got fucking assassinated and there was a huge uprising in Genoa, it is not hard to make sense of his resignation in 1901. Despite the crisis, things were just about to turn for the best, with the nomination of Zanardelli as prime minister with Giolitti as its minister of the interior. This video is very long already and I've just begun talking about the Giolitti era. As minister, Giolitti reformed the local administration, allowing municipalities and cities to have more legislative autonomy. Zanardelli also reinstated many liberal reforms and passed some social and civil reforms that attracted the attention of the Socialist Party, specifically of Filippo Turati, head of the moderates, who began to seek dialogue with the historical left. Unlike his colleague Benito Mussolini, who wanted socialism through uprisings, the Socialist Party had begun to reorganize and run for election during this time, and Giolitti will try to take advantage of their internal disagreements by applying transformism like his predecessors and a bit of realpolitik like a certain German guy called Otto von Bismarck. Giolitti will succeed Zanardelli in 1903, and with the help of Turati, he undermined the radicals by passing social and civil reforms, such as a new set of permissions for the right to strike. In the 1904 election, however, Giolitti began to notice an increase of far-right and nationalist voters who were opposed to Giolitti's reforms with the socialists. In order to combat another eventual increase which could challenge its authority, Giolitti went to Pope Pius X, where they agreed on dissolving the non-expedit, hence releasing a new set of moderate voters ready to vote for Giolitti at the next election, which was going to be in 1907. Despite Giolitti's relative political stability, he decided to resign in 1905 with the pretext of health reasons. To take his place in the next year or so will be Tommaso Tittoni, Alessandro Fortis and Sidney Sonnino. All of them came from very different political alignments but were brought into working together by Giolitti in order to achieve one clear goal: nationalization of the railways, something which was very popular among the voters at the time. By 1906, this became reality and the historical right and left began to work together to face the new political forces in the parliament, such as the socialists, the republicans, the radicals, and the ultra-Catholics. Giolitti's third cabinet between 1906 and 1909 is deemed by many as the peak of the Giolitti era. During his time in government, he fixed the state balance through a series of financial reforms, which essentially lowered the rates of the government bonds. With all the extra money, Giolitti invested in a lot of public works all over the country, although mostly in the north, like when he reclaimed the swamps in Rovigo and Ferrara, something that many people mistakenly credit this upside-down fellow for. The vast amount of newly arable land was great for the economy and for the well-being of the Italians, who suddenly had more food. According to the historian Alessandro Mola in his book History of the Italian Monarchy, the Italian lira during this time was more popular than ever, even beating the English pound, and had surpassed gold in its value. Giolitti also passed many economic programs aimed at the south, specifically to Messina and Reggio Calabria, which at the time were afflicted by a terrible earthquake and flood, specifically in 1908. The plan was too little too late to fill the economic gap between the two halves of the country, although it did help a little. Giolitti was actually very unpopular in the south because he legit did not care about the less urbanized areas, but that's besides the point. He also passed some laws which regulated labor for minors and women, imposing a 12-hour limit for each and making it illegal to work under 12 years old. In 1909, the liberals won once again, hence proving that Giolitti's strategies worked. The fourth Giolitti cabinet was the closest successful attempt to involve the Socialist Party in the government, which in any case voted in favor for its appointment at the parliamentary vote. The program included the nationalization of life insurance and the introduction of universal male suffrage, projects of considerable social value and both immediately implemented. In September 1911, Giolitti, pressed by the nationalist forces, however, started the war in Libya. The conflict had considerable repercussions also in internal politics, dividing the Socialist Party and removing it from the alliance permanently. Turati was strongly against colonial endeavors, while Mussolini, after the initial opposition, later changed his mind. Despite the new territorial gains, the war was costly for Italy and had lost most of its economic edge it had gained in the previous years. At the time, however, nationalism was very fashionable, so Giolitti's public image was not too damaged. Now I'd love to get into the whole World War I stuff and what came later, but honestly I feel like this video has gone far enough. If you want to know more about Italy a bit before the Great War and what came later, then I strongly suggest Orlando's video and the first episode of Italian Presidents. Links will be in the description. All I'm going to say is that Giolitti, after a long career of social contributions to the nation, will resign in 1914 before the elections and will be succeeded by Antonio Salandra, who will bring Italy into the war. His last government was between 1920 and 1921. Giolitti at the time was 72, incredibly old for the time, but the Liberal Union had no other option. Italy was going through the Red Years, characterized by civil unrest and poverty, which eventually led to many far-left revolts and the rise to power of Mussolini's regime with the March to Rome of 1922. Despite Giolitti's excellent handling of the Fiume expedition started by Gabriele D'Annunzio, here's the video on him here, Giolitti was not able to bring order to the war-torn nation, which unfortunately fell into authoritarianism. Despite initially voting in favor of Mussolini's government in 1922, Giolitti turned its back to the fascists when they killed Matteotti and essentially abolished the freedom of press, the same law he had fought to reinstate in the Pelot years. In 1925, he was asked to sign up to the fascist party, but he refused, gradually appearing less and less in the political sphere because the Duce summoned the Chamber of Deputies more rarely over the years, so he didn't have a lot of chances to express his contrary take on what was happening. He will die in 1928 after catching pneumonia. According to some newspapers, in the day of his death, some fascists were standing outside his home waiting for the news of his passing, so they could celebrate. Giolitti had certainly his ups and downs, many of his methods resulting very grim, if not cruel by modern standards, but despite this, he did make Italy a better place and fought until the end against those who wanted to take rights and freedoms away from the weak. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I certainly did enjoy writing it, editing a bit less. As usual, remember to like, comment and subscribe, and I will see you next time.